When the legal sale of recreational marijuana was approved in Massachusetts 3 years ago, it was hailed as a gain for racial and economic justice. But hurdles remain to providing a fair share of benefits for communities most heavily penalized by the war on drugs. That's the reason for steps that could soon be up for a vote by the City Council. To tell us about the evolution of a proposal she made earlier this year is the councilor from Roxbury's District 7, Janey. Thank you very much for being with us, Councilor.
Thank you so much for having me.
So rewind a little bit to the beginning of this year, the way things stood with the pipeline to getting these shops open. You were certainly disturbed by it to make this proposal in the first place. What did you see?
Well, I heard from a number of entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs who were trying to enter into this space, that they were not getting a lot of guidance from our current system, that they had questions that weren't getting answered, phone calls, emails not getting responded to. They were kind of just left out there. What we know from this industry, if we just look to other states, we know that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. We know that those who are better positioned because of their wealth will come in and take up all of the licenses in Boston if we didn't do something. For me, this was an economic justice issue, really wanting to make sure that those who are coming from communities that are disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, mass incarceration, had a fair shot at participating in this arena, and that we were being intentional as a city in terms of creating an inclusive economy. And that, I thought, was particularly important given the wealth gap that we have here in Boston, where black families have an average wealth of $8 compared to white families who have the average wealth of $247,500. And we know that that exists because of policies in the past. And here's an opportunity before us to kind of level the playing field here, to make sure that we're creating a process in Boston that has much more clarity, that has much more transparency, that was laser-like focus on equity, and where there was some accountability. And that's what we've been able to put forth for a vote tomorrow. So I'm really excited about that.
One thing the council in America cannot change right away is that there are federal restrictions on bank loans for marijuana businesses. So how do you help small startups overcome that?
Yes, and that is a challenge that came out in the first hearing that I chaired at the end of last year, right before I put forth this legislation. And it became clear that we needed a revenue stream that could be helpful to aspiring entrepreneurs. And so the legislation that we'll be voting on tomorrow creates an equity fund to help those who would qualify under the equity program here in Boston and support their efforts.
Now, of course, what you're trying to do is help these businesses that are run by people of color, people
Yes.
who've been affected by the war on drugs in the past, at least on a community-wide basis. How do you help them? I mean, what's the right ratio of helping these kinds of businesses as opposed to the other kinds?
Well, in February, when I introduced the legislation, I was calling for a 2-to-1 ratio. Where 2 for every non-equity applicant that moved forward, we would have 2 equity applicants. And given the disproportionate number of black and brown people who are still serving time for bogus, drug enforcement policies that penalized and criminalized black and brown people, I really wanted them to have the foot in the door when it comes to marijuana businesses in Boston. And so that's why we came with the 2-to-1. We didn't get the 2-to-1. We have a 1-to-1, which is still amazing. That says half of these licenses will go to small, local, diverse companies who meet criteria as outlined in the equity program here in Boston. And that's important. But what's also important, Chris, it's not enough to just have half of the licenses throughout the city for these diverse companies from communities disproportionately impacted. It's where we get to play as well. So I believe it's also important not just to say half in the city of Boston, but we know that there are high traffic areas in terms of many shoppers coming or tourists coming to our cities, places like the Seaport, like Faneuil Hall and Fenway and Copley and Newbury. We need to make sure that entrepreneurs from our local community can also play in that arena. And so that's what I hope to move forward, beginning next year, is to kind of take this to the next level. This is one piece of the pie that we need to make sure that equity applicants can partake in that pie, but there's more work to do.
Of course, you also want to have a board that regulates this. You want a balance of power, and you want to make sure that nobody's fooling around with that power either. So how does your proposal do that? So
the board is an important piece of it. I am thrilled to share that Mayor Walsh will be creating this board through an executive order, which will be like a companion piece to the legislation. The council by itself can't create boards and commissions, and so he is offering that companion piece, which is great. And what I've called for, at least in the original legislation with the board, was representation from people who were disproportionately impacted, who perhaps were arrested on a marijuana charge, to be able to participate on this board, someone who had expertise in public health and public safety. I think first and foremost, having a board that understands the issue of equity and making sure that we are creating an inclusive economy where our local aspiring entrepreneurs can certainly play here in their home city.
I know for every marijuana shop there are a few people involved maybe, and it looks like it's not a big deal, but if you have more balance and fairness in who benefits, does that help the rest of the neighborhood in some way, having an owner like that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And so there is, as I'm sure you could imagine, there are a number of residents in the city who have questions and concerns, even though the ballot initiative passed overwhelmingly in Boston, with almost 63% of Boston voters saying that they wanted to legalize. I think there are many residents who still have questions and concerns. So who gets to open up is important, and making sure that those entrepreneurs who have strong ties to the community, who will be a good neighbor, hearing the concerns from residents also inform the thinking with this ordinance. It was very important that we made sure we had a process that community voice was incorporated, and so that's a weight within our the scoring in terms of criteria for how we judge applicants, taking into consideration community voice. Also, residents had a lot of questions at the community meetings around who's backing the individual, where's the money coming from, and so there's greater scrutiny now. And that's important, not just because residents wanted to know that information, because we all need to understand that information if, in fact, we are prioritizing small, local, diverse companies. We need to understand who truly owns the company and who truly controls the decisions in that company. And so there's greater scrutiny that we have in this legislation so that we know for sure who the investors are, who's really backing this individual. What we don't want to do is have companies come in and prop up an individual who they say is the owner, who represents that community, when in fact it's a larger corporation, maybe from out of state, who's not really representative of the community.
Finally, just a little time, the vote on changing Dudley Square to Nubian Square, it was pretty strongly in favor of that from Roxbury. What do you think should happen next?
Well, as we stated in the hearing that we held a couple of months ago, we're going to follow through on what the voters said that they wanted. And for me, I think what is important is all of those folks who voted to change the name, that they continue to support the square. There are a number of stores in Dudley who certainly need support, and so we all need to make sure that we're putting our money where our mouth is and that we're supporting small business owners in Dudley.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
City Councilor Kim Janey.